Gary Chestnut. I'm chairperson of the Community Environmental Network. Well, the reason why it's important, as illustrated on this slide, it's an area of natural vegetation. The land was purchased back in 2014 by the then Wyong Shire Council for $7 million. And council then resolved to sell the land in 21st of September 21. In March 21, council's advisory committee recommended council, due to the conservation values of the Doyalson land, that the interim administrator should consider retaining the land in council's ownership. The acting administrator, Dick Person, said he wouldn't sell environmental conservation land, wasn't going to be a fire sale, and council's COS committee said it was important. And then you've got council's unit manager of economic development was invited to give a presentation to the COS advisory committee because they included the Doyalson land in Trench 1 as a potential site to be sold. And so that was a contradictory to everything that had been informed beforehand. And then also too, in September 21, I sent a letter off following that meeting to their then director, Scott Cox. And at that stage, the administrator had changed to Rick Hart. And the presentation to the COS committee was very offensive. And the reason being, community members wanted to ask very legitimate questions on transparency on what council was doing to this block of land. And the council officers just threw up a brick wall. There was no opportunity to get informed information. The committee wasn't after information incompetence. It was just after how did council go about selecting this site for identification for sale? Given the fact that it was environmental conservation land, given the previous statement for Dick Person that he wouldn't sell environmental conservation land, part of the land was Zone C2. Under the standard instrument, you have C1, C2, and C3 and C4. They're in order of importance of environmental integrity. C1 is just for national parks. C2 is the next highest category. C3 is after that. So C2 is saying it's got high environmental attributes, like it's got endangered ecological communities, it's flood liable, it's threatened species habitat. And so you want to put those sort of things in a C2 land. Okay, and this Doyalson land has part of the land Zone C2. We then jump onto the letter to Rick Hart, and I actually asked him 9 questions about the conduct of council officers and how did the fact that council ended up putting this land on for sale. And there also stated that the council had engaged external contractors to examine the biodiversity value of the land. So in other words, here's an area of land that the council owns, and they had engaged biodiversity consultants to undertake a biodiversity development assessment report on the site. In other words, somebody knew it was environmental quality to do that report. We then jump on to the next slide, and the letter forwarded to Rick Hart regarding incorrect statements he made to the public. And that is that he actually said various statements from their communication that regarding the Doyalson land, which were wrong. So I then documented his statements, went back to Mr. Hart and said, wait a minute, what you said to the public was incorrect. They are not based upon the facts we know. And he has said, the matter has processed and the matter is now closed. And they failed to adequately explain how council's executive leadership team decided to include the Doyalson land in Trench 1. The council's valuer in actually putting this land up for sale only forwarded information relating to the planning information, and it avoided answered questions regarding the environmental assessment of the land. And instead of providing a copy of the proposed biodiversity stewardship agreement, noting the report council of the 30th of November 2020, it states the loss of biodiversity stewardship agreement site simply responds, no biodiversity stewardship has been prepared. This was a report that council prepared in November 2020, identifying the Doyalson land as not having any environmental value, and noting that in the council report, it did stay in fine print, it would end up losing biodiversity stewardship agreement site.
The Wyong Council had originally acquired this land for its biodiversity value, hadn't they? Because they wanted to use it to offset the site of a proposed airport.
100% correct.
Okay.
So it was purchased for two reasons. Part of the site definitely has environmental characteristics. part of the site is disturbed, but the majority of the site, all that area through there, all that area through there, all that area there, and the majority of that area is undisturbed.
And I also recall, just to interrupt you one more time, that there were particular attributes about the wetland part of this site that meant that it was its performance for filtering water was quite unique and superior.
Absolutely. This site had actually been identified by a State of Environment report by the former Wyong Council many, many years ago of its intrinsic value to the water quality of the Tuggerah Lake system. And it actually has very, very low phosphate levels, extremely low. And so therefore, because of that, it was actually a filter or a kidney to the lake system. Correct.
Right.
That was actually in the State of Environment report. Because of the soil characteristics, it identified that if you ended up developing this site, it would lose the natural retention ability of phosphorus, and the level of phosphorus from the catchment would increase by 600%. That's from a council report.
All right. So we've got land bought for its conservation value, suddenly ends up on the first tranche of land to be sold by council. Council have even kept the fact that they know its biodiversity value from their own valuer.
Correct.
What happens next?
Well, the land was purchased for $7 million back in 2014 for the purpose of both development in a portion of the site and biodiversity offsetting for the rest of the site. Rick Hart sold the land for $5.5 million, resulting in a direct loss of $1.5 million. Bear in mind that's land values from 2014 up to 2022. The acting director in a public meeting in July 2022 said the loss of the environmental value site had identified that 100 hectares of the 200 hectare site was suitable for only to be used for industrial purposes. You know, the approximate size is greater than 200 hectares, but 200 hectares of the site was identified for industrial purposes. So it didn't have environmental value for what it was used for. And so it was sold for industrial valued land, undeveloped, for the value of $5.5 million. That just blows your mind. Land that was bought for environmental values, and then the council publicly states that 100 hectares of the site could be used for industrial purposes, and the administrator still justifies the loss of $1.5 million. It just, it just does not compute in any shape or form.
And then how did you end up finding out that there was a biodiversity study, like a conservation study already done?
Okay, that comes to GIPA applications. And so by putting in GIPA applications to the council, due to the sensitivity of the site, and from the GIPA application, council engaged an ecological consultant in 2018 that identifies the Doyalson land has 8 threatened species recorded on the site and the potential habitat for an additional 11 threatened species, resulting in a potential of 19 threatened species plus 3 endangered ecological communities on the site. And the consultant calculated the site generated 404 biodiversity credits. And applying the biodiversity credits at that time, it meant the dollar value was worth at least $1.24 million.
Okay.
The purchase price of $7 million.
So they should have at least sold it for $8.5 million, not $5.5 million.
Yeah, that's using dollar values of the biodiversity credits in 2017 and the value of the land in 2014. Value of land in 2014, and if you only applied the biodiversity credits to 2017, it should have been, $7.24 million basic.
So this wetland now becomes privately owned. And then a whistleblower tells you that it's been cleared.
Central Coast Biodiversity Stewardship Agreement. They not only did they actually have an independent consultant do an evaluation of the report back in 2017, council actually has a registered or certified biodiversity assessment officer on the staff, and the staff in 2020 then revised the biodiversity assessment report that was done in 2017 to 2020 And if you then apply today's dollar values of 2020, that $2.4 million jumps up to $2.7 million. And between 10 to 14 hectares of the 140 hectare site is not directly impacted by having the presence of threatened species and or endangered community. Now notice on here, we've actually now found out that the site is only 144 hectares, and council implied 100 hectares of that was suitable for industrial development. Yet council's own biodiversity stewardship agreement prepared for the site identified that there was between 5 and 10 hectares of the 140 hectares were not directly impacted by the presence of threatened species. That means in round terms, there was 134 hectares of the site qualifies for biodiversity credits.
And so in terms of it qualifying for biodiversity credits, that means that the government, the council could have turned it into a stewardship site and,
yes.
and it would have produced income for the council. Is that correct?
It would have, in 2020, it would have received $2.7 million to manage the site.
And so is that sort of money ongoing if you've got a stewardship site?
Yes, the money is ongoing. The money of 2.7 million is held in a trust, and then the council then applies to the trust, and it gets an annual, whatever it spends on the land, it can keep spending the money. With the $2.7 million, they could spend it all at once, or they could spend like $100,000 a year, and the $2.7 million accrues interest. And so you, in other words, you've got a bucket of money of $2.7 million held by the trust. The council can then apply how much money it wants to use from that $2.7 million on the protection of the land. And so
they've made a loss on the market value of the real estate, and then there was an opportunity cost on top of that for the land becoming a regular income source.
Correct. In other words, it's got a bucket of money of 2.7, and they could have, and as long as you spend the money on the land, you can access that bucket. But if you don't spend the money on the land, the bucket accrues interest and it keeps on increasing in value. So in other words, you can have a perpetual bucket of money to manage the land for, forever, provided you don't, in other words, if you keep on using the amount of money it draws in interest, you'll always have an income source. In exploring biodiversity value of the land, council indeed prepared a report and commenced negotiation with state body. However, these negotiations did not progress. So notwithstanding they hadn't signed the agreement, the council's valuer said that if you've got that information, it will definitely increase the value of the land, and that was declined to be given to the valuer. In my view, there is no justification for council taking the action to sell the land. Totally. The boundaries have no relationship to actually what's on site.
Okay. So just for the sake of our audience, you are not allowed to clear endangered ecological communities, threatened species, are you?
Correct. It's a breach of the Biodiversity Conservation Act of 2016.
Okay. But what happened to this land? What happened after the land was sold?
After the land was sold, a portion of the land had been cleared illegally. Now, because it's private land, we could not go on site to undertake an inspection. However, we are aware that the Environmental Protection Authority, the relevant branch in government, commenced an investigation. The investigation did identify that unlawful clearing of the threatened species had occurred, but they just gave them a token fine. So
there was a stop work order though.
Yeah, the stop work order, and it was actually on for a long period of time. I'd say around 12 months. That token fine of $1,700 also required the area that was cleared to be rehabilitated. It didn't go to court. It was an order issued by Department of Environment and Conservation. They acknowledged a breach and they served an order, and that order included a fine and a requirement to do rehabilitation. The only option, sorry, to put it back in public ownership, and it actually has been suggested at different times that council should repurchase the land, but would have to purchase it at market value. And I'm
Okay.
quite sure the market value is not going to be 5.5 million. It'll most probably be double that value.
But the current owner could apply for Biodiversity Conservation Trust. You know, they could do the stewardship agreement, couldn't they? And they could
Absolutely.
get the funding.
Yes, they could. I was going to say they could also sell their biodiversity credits on the open market.
Okay. And in terms of the impacts of the clearing on the viability of the wetland, we have no idea because it's private property and we can't look at it.
Correct.